Welcome to Chapter 5, Regulating and Resisting Identities. In this chapter, we take a look at the ways in which our identities are used as a mechanism of control, both in the context of other entities, institutions using identity as a mechanism of control, and in the ways in which we use kind of these cultural discourses as a way of self-discipline, as a way of controlling ourselves in the context of a larger culture and these larger cultural discourses that are really important. Identity regulation is really important, and it's tied to identity because if you remember early on when we talked about identity, we talked about asking questions like, who am I, right? That is kind of the quintessential identity question. But the question related to that is, how should I act? And when we say, how should I act, that is a control question, right? If I'm going to act like a professional, I'm going to discipline myself then in certain kinds of ways. I'm going to use certain kinds of language. I'm going to dress in certain kinds of ways. I'm going to carry my body in certain kinds of ways that all live up to what we have decided is what it means to be professional. So identity and behavior is linked. And so that means identity and control, identity is very much linked to the ways in which we act. And so a lot of organizations, institutions have invested heavily in trying to shape people's identities, because if you can shape their identities, then you shape how they act. So in that chapter, we go through the 4 types of control that Edwards lays out, and I'm not going to go through all of these here, but instead focus on this 4th one, which is concerted control. And concerted control is control through identity, through identification with a particular group, and then in peer enforcement of that group. And so in concerted control, I might be working in a team, and this team has certain kinds of values that it upholds, and I see myself not as separate from that team, but as a member of that team. I think of myself as essentially one. I am a member of that team. I am that team. And so subsequently then, I'm going to act as if I'm a member of that team, and my teammates are also going to hold me accountable for acting as if I was a member of that team. And I'm going to hold others accountable on that team to act that way. And so you can see, if I link myself, if I identify with that team, it creates this really tight system of discipline and control in that I act according to the team, and I encourage others around me to act according to the values of that team. Now, this is known more broadly as normative kinds of control. And this idea that we focus on hearts and minds, ideology and identification become the key words, the key framing. And so in many ways today, when you actually have to exist in overt kinds of control, when you have to tell somebody, hey, knock it off, or you're not doing your job very well, that's really a failure of these sort of larger, more powerful kinds of controls that are at the level of ideology and identification. Most of the time, we internalize particular discourses, and I keep using this idea of professionalism because I think it's an easy one to get. But if I internalize that notion of I am a professional and act that way, right? I'm going to show up on time. I'm going to use certain kinds of language. Nobody has to discipline me or tell me to do that. I am going to self-discipline myself in ways that are sometimes more profound than anybody could actually do to me. Stan Dietz, in some of his research, for me, it's a classic example. He was studying these high-tech workers who were working as internal consultants at a telecommunications company. And they internalized this notion of being a consultant so much that they were able to self-discipline themselves in ways that no manager could ever require of them. So for example, they considered it a victory when managers finally allowed them to put cots in their offices so that they could just lay down for a couple of hours at night and continue then their work really throughout the night. They didn't have to bother with things like going home and being with their families, because that got in the way of the work that they were doing as these internal consultants. If a manager said you have to sleep on cots, you would absolutely say, you got to be kidding me. You can't make me do that. But because we identify a certain way, we will do that to ourselves. Many of you have probably stayed up all night or most of the night studying for a test. Now, no professor could say, I want you to stay up all night, right? You'd complain, you can't do that. But we will do it to ourselves. And so once we identify, whether that's as a consultant, as a good student, we will then discipline ourselves in ways that are sometimes pretty profound in order to live up to that identity that we have taken on. So last thing I'm going to talk about in this video is this notion that identity regulation then has become a really important contemporary practice that we have to consider when we're talking about the formation of our own identities and some of the influences that are on our identity. So Alvison and Wilmot say identity regulation encompasses the more or less intentional effects of social practice upon the process of identity construction and reconstruction. So there's a lot of powerful interests. These could be parents, these could be religious groups, these could be sports groups, these could be educational groups, these could be work groups. All of these entities, organizations, have a stake in shaping identities because that has a big impact then on how people are going to act. And some discourses have more influence, they're more appealing, more powerful than other discourses. And I'll end with the last bit here. Remember, we're talking about a continuum, right? We've talked in the last couple of chapters, 3 and 4, dealt much more with this idea of agency. We have the power to shape who we are. This one is making the argument for regulation and the notion that we are just sort of freely construct our identities in any way that we want. A lot of scholars call that idea into question and say, yes, you can choose from discourse, but some of those discourses have pretty high consequences for choosing not to follow them. If I decide I'm not going to act like a professional or take that on, that's going to have consequences for my employment and the ability for me to make money. And some of those discourses are going to be easier for me to step into, and others may be less available to me or to others, depending upon other kinds of aspects of your identity. And so we're back to this continuum, agency and regulation. You may tilt one way or the other, but it's really important to consider both of these as part of this process of identity formation.